Hello, how you doing, and welcome back to the channel. I've just rewatched the 2019 Rugby World Cup final. It's been 4 years since, from an English perspective, I unfortunately had to watch it the first time round, but I've rewatched it. There's some interesting things to take out of it. So that's what I'm talking about in this video. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of South African fans that have rewatched it many times over the last 4 years. So make sure you have a comment down below, have your say on the game, how you view it with hindsight. It's always quite interesting watching a game when you know the result. So do make sure you drop your opinion in the comment section. Like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. But without further ado, let's get into it. So I feel a little bit like we've hit this point in the season. Certainly in England, I know that the French league still has its final to come. But in England, where it's a little bit of a lull maybe before we get really excited about the build-up ahead of the World Cup, was probably struggling for content a little bit. And I saw that World Rugby on their YouTube feed had uploaded the 2019 final in full. So you can go back and actually watch the full match. And I mean, there's not really any reason that I would have wanted to watch the full match over the last 4 years, in all honesty. But I thought, finally, at last, an opportunity to watch it again. And as I say, it was quite interesting. I'm sure many South Africans, as I said in the intro, would have watched it previously. But I'm just going to go through and pick out some of the things that it struck me. And it's always good to watch a game when you actually know the result. But 10 minutes in, I made some notes as I was going along. And after 10 minutes, I jotted it down and I just said, all South Africa, they're turning the screw from the first minute. The pressure that they are putting on England. And that was kind of the story throughout the whole game, really, in that you felt that the tempo of the game, it was exactly the sort of game that South Africa wanted to play. And even though England actually still did some nice stuff in the final, particularly when you compare it to now, one of the things with this game that actually struck me as an England fan, watching England over the last 4 years, where their attack has been so turgid and so poor, they've had a complete inability to break teams down. Actually, in that final against South Africa, their attack did some quite nice things. The South African defence was just so good to be able to keep them out and prevent them from scoring a try. Because actually, when you look at England in this game, and for the most part, in terms of the analysis, it is worth focusing on South African, but I guess I'm drawn to that English perspective just for a moment. The thing when you look at England is they basically had hardly any opportunity to even score a try. I mean, South Africa just kept them out. It didn't matter what they did. They squeezed them. The defence from South Africa was absolutely brilliant. And that was the backbone on which this World Cup final was won. But I mentioned that first 10 minutes. And even with South Africa turning the pressure and squeezing England, you could just tell straight away that not necessarily that England would lose the game, but it wasn't necessarily going to be their day. They weren't playing anywhere near the level that they did in that semi-final against New Zealand. A lot of that to do with South Africa, but they had a couple of passes. Vunipola had a pass when I think he picked up from the base of a scrum and tried to pass it, and it went to ground. Ben Youngs had a loopy pass he looked to put over to the edge of the defence, and it went into touch. There was just those moments. Then you couple that with the Kyle Sinclair injury, which happened pretty early on. The England scrum, which was under a huge amount of pressure throughout all of the game, really. They did actually win one scrum penalty in the second half when Joe Marler came on, but for the most part, they got absolutely obliterated at the scrum. That first 10 minutes, it set the tone for South Africa for what they wanted to do and was really, really impressive. You could tell England immediately must have been there thinking, this is a different challenge. This isn't going like the semi-final. The semi-final against New Zealand, which still, I would be adamant to this day, is one of the greatest performances by an England team ever. It was sensational. But in that semi-final, things went England's way. From the first minute, they scored early, they dictated. When things started going against them in that final, I don't think they had the answers for that. Elsewhere, if I look at some of the other notes I've got, South Africa's carrying. This was something that struck me, even though it wasn't until the final quarter of the game that South Africa actually scored tries. Even in that first half, they were far more regularly getting themselves over the gain line. Their carries had more power. They were making meters, even if it was only a couple at a time early on. They were giving themselves momentum. That was something that I probably didn't really take too much notice of at the time, but physically, they were dominant. And then also England's kicking game, I thought maybe a little bit wayward. In fact, both teams actually at time, they had good and bad kicking game in the final. But that was something that I just jotted down in the notes. Then I've got 19 minutes. So this is before England had a decent attacking platform in South Africa territory. So 19 minutes before England were even really able to give themselves a decent territory. It was when Peter Steph du Toit was caught offside. So a quarter of the game pretty much had gone by before England even gave themselves an attacking penalty. They actually had quite a good attack, as I've mentioned already, and they ended up getting 3 points out of that. Also, something that I had forgotten actually in this game was that maybe it's because from an English perspective, we always remember the Kyle Sinclair injury and that being a massive moment at the start of the final. I don't think it would have made any difference, by the way. I don't think Sinclair staying on would have made much difference in the scrums. I don't think it would have had too much of a difference on the game. But in England, that gets remembered quite a lot. What I'd forgotten about is Mbanambi and De Jager going off in that first half as well for South Africa. So South Africa also had their own injuries to contend with, and clearly they were able to do so a lot better. But the biggest moment of that first half, in my opinion, is when England made it 6-6. So they got themselves back level. They went through a multi-phase attack deep in the South African 22. And actually, it's the closest England came to looking like they would score a try. How I mentioned at the top of the video, they'd never really got in that position. This is pretty much the only time in the game. They were deep, close to the try line, in that 22, multi-phase attacks, and South Africa were able to keep them out. And you just wonder whether that was one of those moments in the final. It was amazing South African defence, but it was one of those moments where 3 points, even though it levelled the scores, probably felt like a victory to the Springboks. And I think it's just a massive moment in that game and why South Africa were able to go on and win the World Cup. Anyway, we get to half-time, 12-6 to South Africa, and that whole first 40 minutes, the Springboks just took it to England, and England didn't really have an answer, and that's kind of what we saw in the second half. It was this quite a tense arm wrestle. And actually, if you're watching it without knowing the result, you're still probably looking at it and thinking, well, England could come back into this. It goes back and forth. South Africa kicked their penalties. England, when they got their opportunities, got 3 points back themselves. But ultimately, if you look at the 80 minutes, South Africa were just so much better. I'm just seeing here, South Africa had scored 3 points at the start of the second half. That was a big moment because it made it a 2-score game. And even though England did then get a 3 of their own, and in fact there was a moment in there where I think England kicked a 3. They then got another penalty very quickly after that, after the restart, where Owen Farrell missed those 3 points. And I wondered whether that was a big moment, because all of a sudden the momentum seemed to feel like it might be potentially heading back England's way. He misses the 3 points. South Africa went right back down the other end and scored another 3 points of their own to again extend that lead. And then we hit 60 minutes. 60 minutes, it's 12-18 in favour of South Africa. And then that final quarter is just dominated by the Springboks. It's where they scored the 2 tries. England didn't really have a look in, and the World Cup went to South Africa. But even though it was close for an hour, or England was still within kind of touching distance, if you look at the 80 minutes, it's probably one of the most dominant World Cup final wins we've ever seen, isn't it? Obviously, New Zealand in 2015 against Australia at Twickenham, that New Zealand side was far better than everyone else in that World Cup and comfortably beat the Wallabies. But even in that game, I remember Australia at times had moments where they looked threatening. They scored tries. England in this game just never really looked like having what it took to be able to beat South Africa. And England since that game have never really been the same. They have still won matches. A couple of years after the World Cup, they had some good Six Nations, but they were playing rubbish rugby during that COVID period. So, from an English point of view, it was interesting. Because as I say, even though they didn't look like scoring a try, actually their attack was a lot better than it currently is, which is pretty worrying when you look ahead to France in 2023. But so those were my kind of general views on the game. As I say, I was just making notes as I went along. I think this is one probably for the Springbok fans that watch the channel, one for you to enjoy more. How's it remembered in South Africa? Obviously, their third World Cup triumph. We have the historic 1995, one of the most iconic moments. The most iconic moment in rugby, one of the most iconic moments in sports, full stop. 2007 as well, and then this one in 2019. I guess the thing for 2019, it's where South Africa were kind of 18 months before to where they were able to get themselves. That's probably the thing that stands out the most. And also, just finally on this one, I'll say from an English perspective, It does get easier watching it, but I must admit, at full time, I was still there feeling pretty down, even though I knew what happened and I knew who was going to win the game. It was a tough watch. I still remember that in 2019, watching that final, particularly after the excitement that was generated from beating the All Blacks in the semi-final. It was a pretty tough one to take, but in terms on the balance of play, there is no one that could have an argument about it. So drop a comment down below. Let me know what you made of the final, your memories of it, if you've watched it again, if you will watch it again. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.